Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. So today right now we're gonna talk about guiding principles for carbon dioxide removal. 2 o'clock we had an event on what the potential of carbon dioxide removal might be. Now we're gonna talk about how we should define it, how we should use it. Hello, everybody. What's going on? Thanks for joining us here. So today we're gonna talk about all right, so let's start that again. Well, not all again, but yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about carbon dioxide removal, what it is, what it's for, what the conversation on carbon dioxide removal should look like. So we have 5 very good speakers. Samantha Tanzer, who's a PhD student at the Technical University of Delft, who's done a lot of work on developing principles which define carbon dioxide removal, which we use a lot in our work to try and sort of scope the conversation. We're going to have Gilles Defran, who's a policy officer at Carbon Market Watch, and then Joe, which self-explanatory, really works a lot on carbon markets, Article 6. Very good to have you here. Then we have Francis Wang, who's a program manager on carbon dioxide removal for Climate Works Foundation, which is a California-based philanthropy that's been working a lot on carbon dioxide removal. Then Matthias Honegger, senior consultant at Perspectives Climate Group, again, working a lot on carbon dioxide removal and on geoengineering and on carbon markets. And then Christoph Butler, CDR manager from Climeworks. So it's very interesting to have a panel with both ClimateWorks and Climeworks. Climeworks does direct air capture, a Swiss-based company. So we'll now pass on to Samantha for her to give her guiding principle for carbon dioxide removal.
Can people see me and hear me okay? I don't see my slides up on the screen. Okay.
Just a second. Yeah, perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Samantha Tanzer. I'm a researcher at Delft University of Technology. And to start us off, I'm going to tell you what we mean when we talk about carbon dioxide removal. When we talk about carbon dioxide removal, which you might have also heard called negative emissions, is what we really mean are technologies that are intended to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. Which sounds fairly straightforward, but these technologies actually have to meet a specific set of criteria if they're actually going to achieve this goal. First, and probably the most obvious, that carbon dioxide has to be physically removed from the atmosphere. If you're dealing with a technology or system that only involves fossil carbon, you can't have carbon dioxide removal. Probably the most familiar way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is via photosynthesis, which is uptake by plants. But it can also be removed using chemicals, which is the basis for a lot of direct air capture, and also via some forms of mineralization. But removal is not enough. That removed carbon then has to be stored permanently out of the atmosphere. It might seem economically advantageous to use the removed carbon to produce fuels or chemicals, and while that has its place, that CO2 usually ends up being re-emitted to the atmosphere and therefore not reaching this goal of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So in the cases of bio-based carbon dioxide removal technology, such as afforestation, we need to make sure that carbon stays in those natural sinks, that we're maintaining those forests basically indefinitely. And in cases where we're dealing with carbon dioxide as a gas, such as with direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture, we have to make sure that we're storing that CO2 permanently, such as in a geologic sink or else in minerals. But removal and storage is also not enough. Carbon dioxide removal to reduce atmospheric CO2 must be net carbon dioxide removal. because the processes and the supply chains of removing and storing carbon also emit carbon dioxide via energy use, agroforestry, transport, and even just losses within the system. So to reach our goal of reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide, we have to make sure that we are storing more atmospheric CO2 than we're emitting in the complete life cycle of these carbon dioxide removal systems. And to make sure we're doing that, we have to make sure that we are accounting for all greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with these removal and storage processes. And this is particularly important if we're designing policies or financial instruments to support or promote carbon dioxide removal, because the last thing we want to do is have incentivize a technology that we think is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but is actually just putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's obviously not the point here. And that was just a very brief overview. If you want to know more in depth about these criteria, about why this accounting matters so much, or also common confusions with other terms or technologies, we wrote a paper on this a few years ago called When Are Negative Emissions Negative Emission? Please feel free to email me and I'd be happy to send you a copy. Before I pass it over to the other panelists, I want to talk about two things that carbon dioxide removal is not. Carbon dioxide removal is not the same thing as carbon dioxide reduction. Where both of these result in less carbon dioxide ending up in the atmosphere, it is only via removal that we can withdraw already emitted carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to compensate for historical emissions or for residual emissions in our net zero future. But more than anything, carbon dioxide removal is not a substitute for carbon dioxide reduction. It will always be easier, cheaper, and safer to not emit the carbon dioxide than have to try to take it out again later. And it is only through massive and rapid reduction of carbon dioxide emissions that we can reach our sustainable net zero future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Samantha. Next, Gilles, please. Sorry. We're good?
Thanks very much. Yes, this works now. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Samantha. Hi, everybody. Actually, there was a great segue to what I was going to talk about, because I wanted to start with exactly this point of the firewall between reductions and removals, and how important it is to account for those separately. I mean, think about how many times you've heard the word net already at this COP. I don't know if you arrived today or last week or any time in between. I'm sure you've heard it too many times. You probably can't show it in on your fingers. Whether it's net something or neutral something, I mean, we hear that all the time. You're carbon neutral, you're climate neutral, you're CO2 neutral. And in the end, it's so unclear what it means. Of course, net zero is a concept that does have some scientific grounding. It is used by the IPCC. There is some clarity around that. But if you ask, let's say, a fossil fuel major or a scientist, what does net zero mean? You're going to have a very different answer. And for many fossil fuel companies, net zero is going to mean continued exploration and extraction of fossil fuels and selling and burning fossil fuels with the hope that we will be able to remove all that carbon in the future. This is obviously not enough. This is not going to work. And we absolutely need to put the priority on reductions today. And the reason why I'm talking about these plans from fossil fuel companies is because I want to talk to you about how removals come into carbon markets. As Mark said, I'm with Carbon Market Watch. So what I'm dealing with day in, day out are carbon markets. And so here, what I'm following are the Article 6 negotiations and the negotiations to establish new carbon markets or to regulate new carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. And in those negotiations, in that framework, we do have removals included as a potential source of credits to be generated under the system. And this raises all the questions that Samantha covered, or checking that we are actually removing carbon. But one point that I really wanted to emphasize is the importance of permanence. Because when we're talking about removals in the context of carbon markets, most market actors do not have in mind the idea of, these very expensive removals that would materialize if we were to fulfill the criteria that Samantha was just presenting earlier. for a very large portion of the market, removals equals nature-based solutions. And so storage, mostly in forests and in other natural areas. And then we had a huge issue of permanence, because of course, the carbon stored in the forest will not stay in that forest on the same amount of years that the carbon emitted when you burn fossil fuels. And so I just wanted to share 2 points on that, two reflections. The first one is I think you shouldn't include removals from nature-based solutions in carbon markets, but if you do it, then how can you deal with this issue of non-permanence? And actually, one of the ways that the UN system has been dealing with it under the Kyoto Protocol, under the Clean Development Mechanism, which was the previous carbon markets before the Article 6 negotiations, was to issue temporary credits. So credits that represent carbon that's stored, but at some point the credit expires, just because at the same time, at some point the carbon is released. And I think that's really the best way of representing the impact you're generating when you purchase these credits. You're not really paying for a reduction in emissions. You're basically paying, if you want to offset your emissions with those sorts of credits, you're basically postponing your emissions and not offsetting your emissions, because at some point that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere. That's, I think, really an important element to keep in mind. Just one last point on this whole question of creating a firewall between removals and reductions. I mean, we can talk about it from a theoretical perspective, and it's all well and good. It's really important. But how can we actually keep companies, individuals, governments accountable for that? How can we enforce it? How can we regulate it? And I think one of the interesting avenues we have to regulate it is actually through the regulation of claims and advertisements that many countries have around the world. There are laws to prevent misleading advertisements. And this is really something we can build on. To give you just one example, recently, Shell had to pull out their advertising campaign where they were advertising carbon neutral driving on the basis of selling credits for the fossil fuel they were selling. So they were saying, okay, we're selling you fossil fuel, but we have bought some credits, so it's carbon neutral driving. It was found by the Dutch, I think it's advertising authority, that basically this is misleading. And this is really where we can regulate those claims. We can regulate how companies are advertising and using those removals. You cannot just use removals to justify business as usual. That's not going to work. And so regulating that through advertising standards and laws against misleading advertisement is really an avenue that we could and we should pursue.
Great, thank you very much, Gilles. Now we'll turn to Francis in California.
Hey, hi everyone, good afternoon. So yes, to follow on Joseph's point in creating a firewall between removal and reduction, I see two major challenges when it comes to carbon removal in my work. One is, what is the role of removal within climate action? And two is, how do we create frameworks to ensure that removal is truly effective? And so my suggested intervention in the near term is to create separate removal and reduction targets in national policy and corporate pledges. This applies both to the net zero pledges, like the 1,200 companies and 120 countries have proposed, as well as new entrants into the carbon neutrality claim system. And within these pledges, temporary removal should not be used as offsets for fossil-based emissions to reach net zero or true zero. And the idea is that this would inspire a few immediate actions. One is the calculation to estimate the amount of residual versus mitigation that's needed nationally and globally over a period of time. Two is similar to the NDCs, negotiations would begin on who is responsible for what level of removal. And then there will also be negotiations on what should be considered residuals and what form of removal would be then eligible to be used in an offset situation for different types of residuals. And the principles or implications that would come out of this activity would be, one is it would legitimize, so having national government or corporate pledges, having to create separate removal versus reduction targets would then legitimize removal and define its role within climate action. And within this, ideally, we would stop conflating removal with traditional offsets. For example, afforestation would be very different in terms of how it's treated in the market as, say, prevented deforestation. And two is it would stop equating temporary with permanent removal mechanisms because they come with different costs and they also come with different timelines. And two is it would provide a clearer sequencing over time in how removal should be done. So when should we do what type of removal and where? Three, it would stop using removal to perpetuate fossil fuel use and extraction, which is a key point of concern for many environment justice groups globally. And finally, having this legitimacy and having a direction of where people who engage on the removal topics would then open up ways for more groups to engage meaningfully on the content. And we will have a I would say following a distributed governance or participatory governance principle when it comes to deciding on the future of removal. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Francis. Now, Christoph, please. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So yeah, perfect. So hi everybody, it's great to be here. So what can Climeworks bring to the table? I think we'll probably start from the perspective of a supplier of very permanent carbon removal credits. So what we do at Climeworks is we have 15 plants in the field doing different things, but the one I want to talk about is our latest one in Iceland called Orca, which is also the largest direct air capture and storage or carbon removal facility via direct air capture in the world. And what we do there is we take CO2 out of the air and then we mineralize it underground with our partners at COP26. So the CO2 is literally stored for forever, for tens of thousands of years. So we are that kind of, pure permanent solution. Problem is that the capacity of that plant is 4,000 tons, so it's tiny and it has to be scaled up. Now, if we take, for example, Carbon Market Watch's position and say we shouldn't even include nature-based solutions in removal because they are not permanent enough, even more of this falls to us or to the technological solutions that remove CO2 permanently. Our position is we need a portfolio and we should really use everything. But I think if we want to move into that world of permanent solutions, what we need to do is an unprecedented scale up. And that is something that is not yet too well understood. So our customers are, for example, Microsoft, Shopify, Stripe, the Economist Group, and they really buy it not just from us, but also other players in the field at almost any price, because they understand if they don't scale it up, because the policies are not in place to scale it up, it won't be there at the volumes that are needed when we need it. So maybe two more perspectives I would like to offer. So one on the perspective of, can we continue to emit as we do and burn fuel and then take the CO2 back out of the air? We can absolutely not. And if you're in the weeds in this, it's not just a moral hazard argument. It's an economic argument, because we're chasing 410 parts per million, and that's always going to be a lot more expensive than sucking hydrocarbons out of the ground and burning them. Cleaning up the mess is a lot more expensive. So that puts kind of a cap on that. And maybe to do the loop to the principles, we absolutely agree. So removals mean we take it out of the atmosphere and we store it away permanently. That's a removal. Everything else is not. So the molecule has to come from the atmosphere and end up somewhere permanently. And because that's such a different perspective and also such a different price, we also would absolutely argue to split the markets and not mix avoided emissions with removal markets. And we really need to safeguard these new removal markets and scale and try and scale them up in a pure form. Otherwise, we're not really removing, we're just telling ourselves we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Matthias, now. So you have some slides, right?
Yeah, please. Oh, sorry, that was a bit loud. Oh yeah, thanks. So the thing is, there is nothing that I can disagree with that has been said so far. So I will try to sort of give a complementary take on this and start off by saying something that may be surprising for different reasons to different people. Carbon dioxide removal or greenhouse gas removal, as defined in the previous contributions, is a form of the mitigation of climate change under the UNFCCC and under the Paris Agreement. And this is, to me, surprising that some people still find this confusing. But it is, that's the legal analysis. That's also what holds a number of implications when we start talking about principles that should or will guide carbon dioxide removal. And basically what I did there fairly quickly and just as a starting point, much more than a finished thought process, is to give a sort of an idea of the different dimensions of the principles that sort of apply to mitigation of climate change presently in the climate regime that we have, and to sort of start to point towards directions that need to be further developed in the process towards using carbon dioxide removal in the spirit of the Paris Agreement. So one end of the spectrum to your left is, broadly speaking, the topic of ambition. That includes the need for countries' contributions to progress over time, to be comprehensive. That's already rooted in the convention text, and the need for industrialized nations to take the lead, the need for those who have the highest responsibility and respective capacity. And so moving over towards top right, the CBDRRC principle suggests also that not only industrialized nations need to move first into those areas that are the most costly, the most difficult, the most technologically challenging, but also that they need to provide support to those that aren't as in the same position as they are. And that means the topic of technology transfer and of climate finance, both of which are expressions of that support that needs to be there. And on the bottom right end, basically, environmental integrity is really a package of ideas that describe essentially that what you claim is happening is actually happening. So when we describe carbon flows, it is only environmental integer if the result that you claim to have achieved is actually what's physically happened, or as close to that as is possible, because there's always uncertainty. And in a similar area, we have this issue of needing clarity of the intentions in the plans, in the NDCs and in the long-term strategies. So that includes clarity on what do you anticipate is, for instance, going to be the share of removals in your net zero target. And transparency, of course, then backwards in reporting on your achieved results. And then there's sort of the boundary conditions which are set up in the preamble to the Paris Agreement, and that's the respect of sustainable or contribution to sustainable development and consideration, promotion, and one more such word of diverse sets of rights, including human rights. We did basically earlier this year publish a paper that sort of sets out what the academic literature says in terms of the principles or the policy needs that we need to see developed for CDR to play a constructive role. And unfortunately, our conclusion was really we're not seeing almost any of those in current policies, in current strategies. But really, I won't go into detail. They're fairly congruent with what has been said already. Perhaps to just point out again, the clarity needed in the plans, the need to accelerate technology innovation and cost reductions, public participation early on, given much of this will in part fall back on taxpayer money flowing into these measures. And the need to scale up, to transition from pilot activities to scaled deployment and to start with pilot activities, even when we don't have all the certainties needed. I think this is underappreciated. Much of what we need to see develop in terms of clarity also only comes through trial and error and hopefully learning. And so this is also where I think right now we need the most work is in monitoring, reporting, and verification. And just as a side note, the CCS Plus initiative, of which Perspectives is a part, is trying to advance this. And yeah, sustainable development I already mentioned. Yeah, so some of the literature.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matthias. Now I'd like to open up the discussion to firstly the panelists. If you have any reactions to what has been said, I'll ask if you raise your hand because we have virtual speakers with us. Is anyone who wants to react to anything that's been said so far? Yeah, go ahead, Samantha.
So I think the point that Matthias made about uncertainty actually ties in very nicely to the discussion about bio-based versus technological carbon dioxide removal. Because I mean, the potential advantage of technological removal, such as direct air capture, such as what Climeworks is doing, is that especially in situations where you have a very short supply chain, where you have your energy source and your storage source in the same place, like I do believe they do very close to each other in Iceland, that makes monitoring and verification easier. And it also means that you can sort of have a bit more confidence in how much you're actually removing versus how much you're emitting in these energy supply chains, which are almost always the biggest influencer to life cycle emissions in CDR technologies. However, the other side of this story is that these technological solutions are essentially, like a waste treatment. They serve basically one purpose, which is this removal. And I think the conversation about bio-based removals is they have a lot more uncertainty and potentially a lot more limitations, but it's also a thing where it can be done very wrong but also very right, because there can be a lot more positive externalities with well-managed forestry and providing for biodiversity and flood protection and even local air quality and economic resources. However, then you do get into the issues of like, well, trees die, there are forest fires, how do you manage that? And I think, if we want to have bio-based technologies be CDR, there really has to be an understanding that incorporated into the cost is the indefinite management of these systems that allow us to use them in a way that's beneficial both for carbon dioxide removal, but also for repair of natural systems and also meeting some of the other sustainable development goals.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha. If I may, I would like to come in here. So let me first say, my aim is not to speak against nature-based solutions, but I think the a priori assumption that nature-based CDR will lead to ecosystem restoration and preserve biodiversity in itself is not entirely always correct, because you could also have monocultures that do the opposite. But I don't want to talk about this. What I want to get at is, I think all of the carbon dioxide removal solutions have co-benefits and risks attached to them. You could say that direct air capture could bring hundreds of thousands of green jobs because it's an industry that has to grow while other industries have to decline. But the wider point I want to make is that we really need to talk about a portfolio of solutions and not pitch one against the other. And there's so many open questions. So really urge us to not, act like we know the answers to all of them.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's what I meant by bio-based has more uncertainties that can be positive or negative. But I definitely think we need all all hands on deck, in terms of technologies and other mitigation technologies as well. It's not just CDR, it's not just one CDR. We need everything right now.
Yeah, and I think in the end, it's maybe not so much about what we're buying, but also about how we communicate it. And of course, there are like let's say the bad CDR, there are the bad removals that are actually not removals. But then when we talk about, let's say we're only talking about good removals that meet all those criteria we've been discussing. Then when it comes about distinguishing between the biological based ones or technology based, I mean, I do see the value in financing all of them. So just to maybe qualify what I was saying earlier, if there was any misunderstanding, I'm absolutely not saying we should not be investing in nature-based removals, right? I mean, we need a lot of finance for nature. That's absolutely certain. The question is, how do you communicate that? And also on the point of, yeah, there is value in financing, let's say, research or projects on a trial and error basis. I mean, there is definitely value in that. I think the issue that I see is on how you communicate that, and the fact that too often we are kind of merging all removals into one pot and saying this is a removal, regardless of whether it's a technology that we already master or something that we're just doing research on, or nature that is not with non-permanent storage, like whatever it is, we just say, yeah, it's a removal, it compensates my emissions. That's not how it works. And so that's, I guess, my point in saying it's maybe not so much about what you buy, but how you use those things and how you communicate that finance that you are channeling.
Yeah, I would also add to the sustainable development or just the lateral benefits, co-benefits, or potential for harm sort of theme, in really again emphasizing we can learn in this discussion from emissions reductions also. This is also why I think it's helpful to think of this as mitigation of climate change, because it's not a new topic to see different options have different spectrum of co-benefits or potential for risk also. And this is, this just shows how early we still are in this conversation, figuring out what is a nationally appropriate mitigation option, for instance, and under which circumstances, through which policy instruments is it implemented? Because ultimately we have been talking about this as if these technologies are sort of falling from the sky and come with inherent characteristics, socially performative characteristics, where actually it's going to be the policies and how they are set up that determine whether you have, for instance, social and economical benefits from much of this. So the distribution of those benefits, the jobs that you mentioned, it really comes down to policy. And I think that's where we're at right now in this conversation. We need to start recognizing this.
Thanks. Francis, I see you've been writing down some notes. Is there anything you would like to add?
Sure, yeah. So I want to kind of just ping back to the discussion of nature versus permanent. For me, the concern is really how they're treated, and to really highlight the fact that they're not equal. And when we kind of think about the existing marketplace and how, even if we do have a separate market system for removal and reduction, and if we're just talking about the removal market, within that removal market, the nature-based solutions are by and large cheaper. They're more abundantly available right now. And also, as many of my panelists mentioned, they don't tend to store over, say 100 years plus time. So it really behooves kind of the market system to course correct for the cost discrepancies between the cheaper but currently available nature-based solutions right now and some of the more permanent solutions that are just coming online, but they are probably not being picked up in the same marketplace because of the overwhelming high cost that is associated with it. But it is needed, we need to raise capital for those permanent solutions so that they could then be useful down the line when we have exhausted our natural resources and sinks. So we need to, the top of mind issue for me is how do we create systems and frameworks where the Carbon Plan has this calculator called the Permanence calculator, where when you factor into the number of years that you need the carbon to be stored and the cost that's associated with it, you may be able to kind of start adjusting for the discrepancy between, nature-based solution and say technological solution that are maybe more permanent. So it at least gives the buyer a way to visualize not just what they can claim to be carbon neutral today, but what they could feasibly claim to be carbon neutral, say 100 years down the line. So it's one. And the other thing that when kind of I think about the different types of removal as it kind of operates within the voluntary market by and large, is this global justice framing. Well, first we know that we need to remove carbon dioxide from the air as of today, or maybe earlier, is because countries, non-industrialized countries or countries who are currently in developing phase are experiencing disproportionately climate impacts right now. So carbon removal not only serves as a way to address residuals or being used as offsets for residuals, but it also needs to be a way to clean up once we reach net zero or true zero. But when we think about the distribution of the nature-based solutions versus permanent solutions that are available and how much we need to invest in them, we can think about the CDM kind of equivalent of how these solutions are the nature-based solutions are by and large situated within developing countries, and how this global kind of extractive imbalance relationship where developed countries are purchasing removal from developing countries, and then what would be available for those countries to meet their goals, and how would that impact local communities on the ground. So those are, I don't have a good solution for that, but I want to raise them as a potential issue kind of down the line as we think about operationalizing removal.
And if I can just jump in a bit, I think this also speaks to what we've been talking about, sort of, I think Matthias put it as the integrity of the accounting. There's a lot of uncertainties still with these technologies. It's like we believe that, that different things have different levels of permanence, that we have different levels of efficiencies, but really monitoring has to be based on actual measurement. This includes, the measurement of the actual, emissions and removals, but also about other impacts that might be happening that might affect communities, such as land use, availability of sinks. This is still reasonably new territory, and we need to be honest with ourselves that there's a limit of what we know and how this is going to affect other systems, other environmental impact categories, such as, water availability, land availability, eutrophication, acidification, as well as, other communities as well. And I think basically we have to make sure that we have a mechanism in which we can account for what is actually happening and not just assuming that something will result in permanent removals or positive or negative externalities, and just document everything. So that way we can reevaluate the process of being like, no, yes, this was a good technology in terms of removal, but look at how much land it's using and it's displacing. It's not a good fit for this specific location. And we have to be able to avoid getting stuck in this, one tracking, that we have to have this one process. We have to keep track of what we're doing. This all ties back into, we need to regulate not just accounting, but also advertising. I thought that was a great point by Jill. What promises and assumptions are being made by the people using this technology.
Thanks. I guess I'll open to the audience. Does anyone have a question? No. Miles? Christian? I'm going to have to ask you to come here, though, because the wire is too short.
Thank you. So my name is Christian Geber-Zeinert. I'm from Southall, and great conversation so far. I just had a bit of a question. There is a lot of noise being made about the distinction between so-called nature-based and technology-based removals. And it seems to me often that, being in the trenches there, fighting this fight seems to distract us from actually commercializing and deploying many of these solutions. And so I wonder a little bit, aside from the fact that many of these solutions are not so easily categorized in either nature-based or technology-based. I think of biochar, for example, or enhanced weathering, or even bio-CCS for that matter. Shouldn't we start talking more about how we can create a kind of, let's say, taxonomy of solutions that outlines all the benefits and durability modalities or conditions of these various solutions, on the basis of which we have a better case to start discussing who can use which solution for what purpose. I would like to put this to the audience, or to the panelists and the audience, whether you are in favor of something like this, a kind of taxonomy of solutions as a basis to start discussing the use cases, rather than what we are doing now is discussing use cases while sort of driving in the dark a little bit.
Matthias first.
Yeah. This sort of ties into what I said in terms of the figuring out what is nationally appropriate. So it is up to every country to come up with a range of mitigation options that they want to pursue, and that is their sovereign right to do so. And I think it's a process that needs to start where countries can also learn from one another and make those decisions with the co-benefits and just generally the good fit for the country's circumstances in mind. And of course, it can, we can develop abstract sort of rankings, but I think we will have, we will essentially just impose our view on others that, have a sort of a regionally rooted understanding of what makes sense in their place. So I think there's a bit of a risk there, but I think at the same time, there are opportunities in coming up with, for instance, sustainable development goals-based sort of examination, which is actually something that I've already done as a sort of a very preliminary sort of mapping. And generally, yeah, fully agree, nature-based versus technological is useless for that. I think the difference is cut in much different ways than just within that dichotomy.
Thanks. Christoph, you wanted to.
Maybe I can add to that. So, violent agreement, but I think a taxonomy is challenging for reasons that Matthias has just outlined. I think we need one, but it needs to provide the right amount of flexibility. So, as I said before, a lot of the so-called nature-based solutions have a lot of technology in them, biochar being the best example. But I think what we at the very least need to do, and there I'm really a fan of the California Livermore National Lab getting to neutral report, because I feel they have done this right. So what they've done is they looked at the state of California and how they can get to zero within the land footprint of the borders of California. And ultimately, obviously, we need to allow for flexibility, but ultimately the planet is that kind of entity, right? And then on the nature-based solutions, what they all have in common, they use biomass. And the one big question is, how much biomass do we have available for this? And that's exactly how they've done it. So they've looked at how much biomass do they have, then they have used that amount, and the rest has to come from the purely technological solutions like direct air capture, which makes sense because they're also more expensive, right? But globally, given the fact that, and this ties into what you said earlier, we don't have all the answers, but we don't have time. We have 30 years max to get to the scale of several gigatons. So we are in that unluxurious position where we don't have all the answers, but we have to get a move on. So I feel at the very least a taxonomy between how much biomass do we have and how much has to come from purely technological solutions would help. And then we just need to start scaling. And what I often say is, what we tend to do is discuss the benefits and risks at the very large scale, so at the net zero 2050 point. But it's, as we established, it's a learning process, and we have to start scaling this, and small scale, small risk, right? So there is plenty of time to learn about the risks and co-benefits as we move along. So what I'm trying to get at is the discussion, or the fact that we don't know everything shouldn't prevent us from getting a move on, because we need to scale it about 60 to 80% per year for the next 30 years. And that kind of scale is unprecedented in human history. It's doable. I mean, electric cars scale at 50, I believe firmly it's doable, but we mustn't wait.
I think one of the big
Samantha is really nodding. Yeah.
So I think one of the big challenges here, and this, comes down to a lot about communication, is that especially, you're working on policy design or direct air capture because, you only have 168 hours in a week. And so when we talk about it, we tend to often talk about, the specific things that we're working on. And I think, that sometimes gets translated into a sort of a metricization where we're focused, on a specific, how we're going to operationalize, because, that's what we're doing in our day to day. But really one of those important things, I think this ties into the taxonomy option is we need to never lose sight of the goal, especially, with the California report's a great one because yes, it's like how California has the goal of getting to net zero, that is always going to be different depending on the specific context. And, and so we can talk about, direct air capture, we can talk about bio-based solutions. But for example, I live in the Netherlands at the moment and, we have a tiny land footprint. So even the amount that we could accomplish within our borders and what our portfolio of options is going to be very different than if we're talking somewhere like say the lower Midwest, the lower west of the US, where we have access to much lower population density, much more solar energy, the Permian Basin. And so again, not taking removal out of the context of, the goal is net zero and some countries and places are going to have much larger capacities for carbon dioxide removal and others. And I don't know if anyone here wants to speak on, so the question that I have is, talking about the justice issue, because in terms of, California, again, it's like whether they can get to net zero within their net zero within their land boundaries. But what about for countries that, currently have a much larger footprint in terms of carbon consumption and emissions than they do in terms of land use, and especially in terms of, countries that import a lot from other countries, a lot of production in developing countries and in China and in India are exported to smaller countries that might have a decreasing carbon footprint domestically, but that doesn't necessarily speak for their carbon footprint globally. And so I think this is going to be very challenging. Well, it already is very challenging, but unless we get sort of global climate market or global carbon accounting that allows us to consider these trans-border impacts of emissions and removals.
Miles? Okay.
Thank you very much to the panel for a great discussion on an incredibly important topic. For those who were there, I apologize because I spent yesterday being the point source CCS, middle-aged, past it bore at a party of what Julia Friedman called sexy young CDR enthusiasts. And I'm going to sort of raise the same point again here. I mean, Christoph's project is, and it's really to start off with Samantha, to just address your point about the CO2 must come from the atmosphere. And I just want to observe that I think it's true that Christoph's project is only possible because there's already a CO2 disposal activity going on at that site where the CO2 didn't come from the atmosphere, it came out of the geothermal plant. So, and if we're going to achieve our climate goals, by 2030, air capture should be, 10% of at most, of a much bigger CO2 disposal industry, most of which will be point source capture at that point. But we don't seem to want to talk about that. And yet we're, I think, kind of depending on it happening. And that's where I'm just, well, the specific question I want to put to you is, we're all excited about these separate removal goals that we're talking about now, that countries are setting themselves. Should countries not be setting themselves separate storage goals, acknowledging that in the end, we need permanent storage to be scaled up faster than just about anything else. I'll put that to the panel. I started off with Samantha, but obviously I'm guessing that others may have views as well. I apologize.
I'm smiling because a lot of my research is in fact on CCS as well as bioenergy and CCS. So I do look at a lot of this, and I think this is a key point. It will always be energetically much, much easier to capture CO2 from a flue gas stream that, is 10 to 30% carbon dioxide than looking at, 400 parts per million. But I think it's just, this is sort of a bigger topic, but, the interesting of CCS definitely has a much dirtier image than sort of the flashy CDR, but it's not just a matter of, we definitely need the development of the storage and transport infrastructure, but also it's going to be a while before we can scale out fossil fuels, even if we have a lot of these lower carbon technologies for heavy industry that are under development, but it's going to be 10, 20, 50 years before they can be deployed on the scale that we currently have these fossil installations. So CCS as a bridge technology, even though it's not particularly popular, especially in terms of it's seen as allowing fossil fuels to continue, those fossil fuels are still going to continue to be used. And using point source capture with transport and storage, promoting that in the near term I think would be a very good way to help build up the infrastructure that we are going to need for larger scale CDR as we downscale carbon intensive production. Though I also want to mention one of the focus of my research is that there are a lot of industrial processes which will always emit carbon dioxide, regardless of if you have a carbon-free energy source. Cement's a great one. 60% of the emissions from cement are from the calcination of limestone. So that's always fossil. And you're always going to have to deal with carbon capture and storage if you want to mitigate those emissions. So thank you for bringing it up. I think that's a great point, and that's definitely one of the things, again, that's a form of carbon dioxide reduction as opposed to removal, which is a little bit of splitting hairs because it is the infrastructure and the system that we need is going to be cheaper and more effective than CDR. But CDR is also going to be advantageous in cases where we have, co-sited low carbon energy and storage for these residual emissions for things that we can't do. So developing in them tandem, again, it's an all hands on deck situation. I think I already said that, but one doesn't preclude the other at all. They help. Decarbonization, one thing, often helps the other because you have these systemic effects.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Miles, for calling us young and flashy. I'm firmly in the middle age, so I enjoy that very much. But so maybe 2 points. So we're not saying we should do CCS, right? If you have a cement plant and you put the CO2 in the atmosphere and then we take it back out, that's stupid, right? What we're saying is 2 things, and I think we all can agree. CCS is not a carbon removal. CCS, if it's fossil point source CCS, avoids an emission. So you're pumping it back down, and some of it obviously goes into the air, so you can't get to 100. That's the one thing. So that's why we're so firm on carbon removals, because we're talking about carbon removals, and CCS does not qualify as well. Should we do CCS? Yes, but where should we do CCS? We should do CCS for unavoidable point source emissions. That's a whole big discussion within itself. I do recognize that. But if we then go to the other extreme of let's just keep burning oil and then take it out of the atmosphere again, to where we think we can get to, namely $100 per ton, that would add $250 to every barrel of oil if you burn it. It's probably not exactly the right numbers, but roughly there. If you take today's cost, it would add about $2,000 to every barrel of oil. So that's uneconomical. And to use a physical example, if I take a bit of sugar and scatter it on the beach, and then you tell me to pick that back up again. That's the challenge, right? So we should do CCS, but just for unavoidables. And CCS is not going to solve the problem of burning fossil fuels, because most of it is not burned at a point source where you can capture it. If that makes any sense. Oh, I've got myself into trouble.
No, I agree with everything, but I just wanted to press on the question, particularly perhaps to Carbon Market Watch. Should we have, or should we be thinking about a separate storage target? I'm not, we're talking about separate removals targets, but should we be talking about setting ourselves targets for CO2 permanently stored back underground? Because, that needs to be scaled up too. And if we just focus on the removal challenge, we may miss out on the opportunity to actually scale storage.
Yeah, and on that point, I think for us, really the priority is on having targets for removal specifically. And I think from having a target on the removal, you're implying you have a target on storage, right? Because we're saying, yeah, you want that removal to be permanently stored. So whatever your target is on removal, that's basically your target on storage. So going to your question of CCS, sorry.
Removal part only is what Miles is saying, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what to point this, sorry, but yeah. So what I was saying, so within your target on removal, then you include that target on storage. And whether you might need more storage, for example, for CCS, I mean, I think we might need CCS at some point, and we can debate at what point we really need CCS. But for us today is not the time. And I think there is definitely a discussion, maybe perhaps a slightly more theoretical discussion of how you use CCS, when do you use CCS. There's a whole rationale debate about it, but I want to emphasize also the political implications and the political debate about CCS, because when you hear companies, especially in the fossil fuel sector, saying, yeah, we're going to support CCS massively, and our plant basically is not emitting anything anymore because we have CCS, that has massive implications at a political level. Like, it becomes a lot harder for policymakers to go ahead and implement actual reduction targets and actual measures that will force companies to reduce their own emissions. So I think we need to look beyond just kind of the rational discussion of what is optimal from let's say an economic perspective, but take into account the fact that basically we're not in a rational society. And so if we have plants that have CCS and that don't emit, like, this is an argument that's going to be used by companies to say you don't need to regulate us because my plant is not emitting anything to the atmosphere. And so I think that's really something we need to take into account as well.
But sorry, yeah, good.
Yeah, so just a few points, I guess. I'm not entirely disagreeing with having, but I phrase it differently, a specific target rather than a separate target. And what I mean by that is, within the Paris framework, what we need to see is more and more nuance in the way that countries are communicating what they're doing. And within that, I think a specific target for CCS capacity can play a very important role. Where I'm somewhat careful or worried is when we get into the politics of seeing a CCS or a storage target being conflated with removals, which is what happens very quickly in these discussions. We still don't have enough understanding that removals is a thing in these halls here, and much less than what they actually constitute. So the work of Samantha is, that type of work is absolutely crucial. And so if we already go ahead and sort of insert a new term, a new concept into that, the politics become much more challenging to make sure that we are clear with what we mean. So the clarity, my first point, the need in the policies is to be clear on what you mean and how you try to achieve that. And yeah, I think that's my main point.
I'd like to ask Francis maybe to interlude a little bit. We've had a lot of conversations about the separate target. And yeah, I'd like to weigh in on this conversation.
I've been listening, and I think I, by and large, mostly agree with the panelists. I think the assumption is that when you have removals, a removal target, you will have a complementary storage facility or storage capacity to address those removals. There's a few challenges I can see that being an issue. One is some of the removals we may be used for utilization purposes. So for example, if we were to think about defossilizing aviation, we would remove CO2 into synthetic fuels for long haul flights. So in that situation, you would not be storing it. Yeah, it would just go back to the air and it would be quote unquote carbon neutral. There are other situations where a country's storage capacity may not be sufficient within their biophysical borders. So you will be withdrawing CO2 and then having to transport it to a site where it can be stored. I can imagine this being an issue probably in countries where there are small island nations or countries that just doesn't have a lot of like biophysical footprint. So that's an issue. So having a storage, what's the difference between having a storage target that is proportional to your removal goals or having a storage target that is, feasible within your biophysical boundary and may be different depending on where you are. And finally, my third point is the build out of certain kind of carbon transport facilities, so pipelines, et cetera. Maybe this is a different situation in Europe, but in the US, there has been a long history of resistance towards build out of additional pipelines. So thinking about the land use implications and the impact on local communities and environment justice implications and how pipelines are perceived, and how the build out of these facilities would then affect people's perception of removal. Is another kind of challenge that I can foresee coming online in the future as we build out these facilities. So I'm sorry I don't have a lot of answers, but I just think these are questions that we need to look into. And finally, I think that we just really need to recognize, and as Samantha and Jose has said, that we don't know a lot. This is an uncharted territory, and there is a tendency, in particular within social science realms, which I came from, is that we want to plan out everything. We want to make sure that there's no downsides before we do anything, any like political action. And I think falling into that fallacy is very dangerous, that we need to start taking certain risks, calculated risk, in order to meet the deadline that, the 2050 deadline that we've set for ourselves. I think we need to balance, the uncertainties versus action here.
Thank you very much, Francis. Unfortunately, we're very quickly reaching the end of the hour. So I will ask, I guess, all of you to give your one, sorry to be very reductionist here, but your one point, the one point in the CDR conversation that you find is really lacking, the one that we really need to be building on more. Okay, I'll start firstly with Samantha.
I think, and a point that we've skirted around today is the emphasis that carbon dioxide removal and carbon dioxide reduction are complementary technologies. And one, the less carbon we have to take out later, it's going to be easier. But also, as we decarbonize our energy and transport, the carbon emissions of carbon dioxide removal also decrease. And therefore, we have a more effective carbon dioxide removal. So really that these aren't separate things. I mean, yes, we might need to account for them separately, but again, we are all striving towards the same goal, which is the net zero future, and we have to find the ways that these things work the best together.
Thanks, Francis.
I think on my end is the recognition that removal is not just for residuals or getting to net zero, but it is also going below zero. And how do we conceptualize that? And how do we conceptualize the responsibilities of different actors in reaching these objectives would be, something that I look forward to discussing going forward.
Gilles? Sorry.
Yes. Yep. So, well, I've been listening to 1 week of negotiations. I'm going to start by renegotiating the question. Instead of talking about what's missing, I'm going to say what's most important for me, and that's the real strong firewall distinction between removals and reductions, and make sure we do have these separate targets in place.
Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, also, I'm agreeing, so I don't have to make that point again. And then I think currently the biggest risk is not doing anything, because we know that removals are built into all the scenarios that keep us within the safeguards of the Paris Agreement. So I'm firmly with Elvis here, a little less conversation, a little more action.
Thank you.
For scale up.
Matthias.
In very few words, it's clarity, the lack of clarity in what is being pledged, declared, and planned for, and also explanations how those plans or actions are aligned with the principles that have been around for 26 COPs, more or less.
Great. Well, that concludes our session. Thank you very much for having joined us. And yeah, have a great afternoon. Francis, have a good day, and see you around. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.